Auxiliary verbs. Before you watch this video, I recommend you go and watch the video on to be and to have to first understand how they are verbs and how they operate in sentences when they are by themselves. That's because these verbs are very unique in that they can join other verbs in verb phrases to then create different tenses. And when they do this, they're known as auxiliary verbs. So let's look at some examples. In I am driving to London, we have the verb am and we have the participle driving, which here is functioning as a verb. It's allowed to function as a verb because it's got a helper to help it to be a verb. And by helper, I mean an auxiliary verb. And that's what that means. It means a helper verb. So here, driving can act as a verb. If we remove it from am, it cannot act as a verb by itself. I driving to the shop. Now it doesn't make sense. So this word, this ing participle, can only make sense when it has a helper to help it. And that is the verb am. So, I am driving to London. Am driving, because there are two verbs together here, act as a verb phrase. So we underline that and we put above it VP for verb phrase. Who is driving? What is driving? I. So I is the subject. To London, we're going to class for now as everything else. So let's look at that structure, am driving. There we have two verbs, the auxiliary verb am and the main verb, which is from the participle there, driving. Let's look at an example where have can come into it. I have driven all day. Here we've got the verb driven and the verb have. They operate together to make this structure make sense. If we just use driven by itself, I driven all day, it doesn't work. And it needs the helper verb, the auxiliary verb have, to join it in order to create sense. I have driven all day. Driven here is the past participle, and when we use past participles like this, we have to have another verb with it for it to function as a verb. Without it, it cannot act as a verb. It will be something else. So here, let's label the sentence. I have driven all day. Have driven is our verb phrase, so we underline it and we put VP for verb phrase. Who is driven? What is driven? I, so I is the subject, and all day is everything else. So here we can see have driven is made up of the auxiliary verb have and the past participle driven, which is here the main verb. So what do auxiliary verbs do? They help other words become verbs in verb phrases. So it is essential that we understand that am, is, are, was, were, and the other being verbs, and have, had, and has are verbs before we ever talk about verb phrases and how these tenses can work together. If you don't have that base understanding, you will never be able to understand how am driving is the entire verb phrase.